There's a feeling I get once every so often in gaming. That feeling when I finish a game and know it will stick with me. The pit in my stomach as I watch the credits roll. The feeling that I enjoyed my time with the game so much that I will genuinely miss playing it. It's almost inexplicable, like the feeling that something has become special and meaningful to you and you get to experience that realization in slow motion. So yeah, I like Final Fantasy XVI. But it was kind of difficult for me to figure out why. The game has an absolute mountain of problems, so many in fact that from a sheer quantity standpoint, the amount of things the game does wrong probably outnumbers the things it does right. And yet Final Fantasy XVI gave me that feeling, so I'm going to try and explain why. Final Fantasy XVI opens with Clive, the son of a duke who is sworn to protect his much cooler younger brother. His brother Joshua is the heir on account of his ability to turn into a giant firebird sometimes. On the eve of a march to war, the duchy is invaded and Clive's father killed. As Joshua turns into said giant firebird out of fear, Clive sees a hooded man who then turns into Vol'jin from Metal Gear Solid 5 and then again into a giant fire beast who attacks and brutally kills Clive's brother. In the aftermath, Clive is conscripted as a slave soldier into the empire responsible for the attack. After 13 years, he finds a chance to escape thanks to Cid, an outlaw who looks like he's 30, talks like he's 50, and sounds like he's 70. He agrees to work with Cid in order to find the hooded man who killed his brother and sets off on his journey. This serves as a really effective setup. Most of this was included in a pre-release demo, and to say that built hype for the game is a bit of an understatement. I think a lot of people who weren't traditionally Final Fantasy fans were drawn in by this intro as well as the promising start the action combat showed. Keeping with recent Final Fantasy offerings, turn-based or ATB combat has been ditched here for pure action combat. The lead combat designer actually worked on Devil May Cry 5 as well as Dragon's Dogma. The early combat is suitably flashy, allows for interesting movement options with a short-range teleport and has some cool special moves, which again enticed a lot of players who wouldn't have otherwise been interested. So those are the basics: compelling opener, action combat, giant monster battles, and a lot of promise. And this is weird to say as someone who ended up loving the game, but most of that promise goes unfulfilled. Let's start with the combat. The core of the combat comes in the abilities you get from communing with those giant monsters called icons. These grant special attacks like a ranged counter that shoots fire or smacking the ground to shoot out lightning, as well as a unique action for each icon. The fire icon has teleport, the wind icon has a claw that will reach out and grab enemies, the earth icon has a shield that can be used for parries, and so on. All of this sounds great, mostly, but the frustration about the combat is what role these abilities are relegated to in most battles. Fights in Final Fantasy XVI can generally be divided into three groups. The first is fights against basic enemies. These are generally easy but provide a lot of entertainment in how many different ways you can dispatch your foes. You can gather all of them up in a single charge up your sword to knock enemies down, or one of my personal favorites, jump into the air before grabbing an enemy, slam them down, lunge forward, and then finish them off.
That's enough.
While there isn't a score ranking for every fight like Devil May Cry, it definitely operates on the same sort of logic. The goal here isn't to win the fight, it's to look cool while doing it. There's also the boss battles. These tend to be simplified in comparison to the fights against basic enemies, as it's more about simple dodging and counterattacking. Despite that, these fights are still generally awesome. The enemy attacks are suitably insane, and for the bigger boss fights it becomes as much about the spectacle as the fight itself. The largest of these could almost be considered set pieces more so than actual boss fights. And while that can certainly be disappointing at times, the sheer lunacy of some of these fights more than makes up for it. So the fights against basic enemies and the larger boss fights both have their own appeal, but the problem is the fights in between, because these are both the least fun and most common of the three groups. You'll frequently be fighting larger enemies that have a ton of health but don't have the interesting movesets of the major bosses. These enemies will also not allow you to perform some of the cooler moves you have access to. You can't grab them, knock them down, launch them, or really anything that involves looking awesome. Instead, they have a stagger bar. Depleting this will break enemies, allowing you to deal more damage for a short amount of time. What this means is the best way to handle these fights is also the most boring. Since the damage multiplier increases with the more damage you do, you're encouraged to save all of your special abilities for when you stagger the enemy. This turns the abilities from interesting tools in a toolkit into a collection of indistinguishable damage dealers. These fights are what caused the combat system to wear on me, and it only really bounced back in the late game as you get access to the final sets of abilities. And what's important to note here is the precarious position the game is placed in if you stop enjoying the combat. See, there's not a lot to this game. It relies on the pillars of story and combat, but there aren't really any other pillars to rely on if one of them starts to crumble. There are some light exploration sections, side quests, and some subsystems we'll talk about shortly, but the bulk of the game is linear segments focused on combat and a story told primarily through cutscenes. It's for this reason that I think this game will end up being incredibly divisive, because the second the game starts to lose you on one of those two things, all of its flaws start to bombard you, because the exploration, side quests, and subsystems that theoretically could pick up some of the slack just flat out don't. Let's tackle those three things before we circle back to the story. The subsystems are the easiest to parse because they're unfortunately pretty bare bones. You have leveling, which gives a marginal stat increases each time and nothing else. There's crafting in shops, which amounts to simply buying the new thing and upgrading the new thing once you pass certain story points in the shop's update. And there's ability points, which can be used to level up each ability exactly one time with the option to master it, which doesn't actually make it stronger but just lets you equip it to icons of a different element. And that's basically it. I think there's an argument to be made that if this game didn't have Final Fantasy in the title, people might not even refer to this as an RPG and instead as a straight action title. The RPG elements are so insubstantial that I can't imagine they were any sort of development priority. The best way to illustrate this is the 4 rewards you get for each combat. These are experience points, ability points, gold, and loot, which is usually crafting items. By the time I reached the halfway point of the game, I had functionally infinite gold with nothing to spend it on, functionally infinite ability points with nothing to spend them on, no use for leveling because it takes like 10 levels to match the stats you get from one sword upgrade, and significantly more crafting materials than I ever needed. This is an aspect of the game where I basically don't have anything positive to say. Thankfully, I do have some nice things to say about the exploration sections. It's also quite bare bones, mostly just amounting to occasionally veering off the path to find a tougher enemy or a chest with contents that don't matter, but it does do a great job of tying the various areas in the world together in a way that makes it feel more connected. There's nothing to reward exploration, but I don't think true exploration is really the purpose of these sections. These are the modern equivalent of the world map, tying one area to the next visually and allowing the player to get accustomed to each area while learning more about the powers that rule it. It's also worth noting the environmental design here is great. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it's everything you could want out of a fantasy world. And then we have the side quests, which is the hardest one to really break down. They're undeniably quite bland, often simple fetch quests, and if they aren't that, they aren't much more interesting than that. And while this entire review so far has been quite negative, this is where we flip the switch and start talking about why I like this game. We'll start with the absolute #1 reason I loved it as much as I did, which is the world building. I've seen a lot of people criticize the early side quests for being pointless, but I couldn't disagree more. The main story focuses on a rather grand tale of countries and kings and big fiery monsters, but the foundations of that story, the backbone which makes said fiery monsters important, is the world that Final Fantasy XVI builds in its slower moments. For the first 2/3 of the game or so, you'll only get access to 1 or 2 side quests at a time. These will almost always give you a better idea of the area you pick them up in, whether it's the main hideout teaching you more about Cid and the outlaws, a small village teaching you how citizens live in a country that doesn't care about them, or a larger town teaching you about people's inherent prejudices and what place slaves have in the world. It's very rare you ever finish a side quest without better understanding Final Fantasy XVI's world. There's certainly overlap and redundancy, side quests that simply reinforce things you already knew, but those still have a purpose. Mechanically, these are equally as bare bones as the exploration and RPG systems, but from a story standpoint they not only hold their own, but make the more bombastic moments hit harder. I will say for absolute certain though that the game gets excessive with its side quests as it approaches the end. I generally don't skip content in these types of games, but even I had to leave a few undone as I wanted to continue the main path. Alright, story time. I'll avoid specific examples from anything besides the start of the game to avoid spoilers. The game picks up from where the demo lets off and sees Clive tracking the Hooded Man and encountering the various countries of the world on the way. After being enslaved, Clive was marked as a Branded due to his ability to use magic. Branded are recognized throughout all of the major countries as being essentially a slave class. Cid provides a refuge for said Branded to live freely, and the game naturally goes from there to trying to change the world into one that sucks a little bit less. Alongside this, they try to stop a phenomenon known as the Blight, which is basically the land slowly turning into an unlivable hellscape, basically like the fantasy equivalent of Phoenix, Arizona. From these setups, the game focuses on a relatively small cast of characters as they navigate around the machinations of continent-spanning powers in order to make a difference. Clive's status as essentially a marked slave provides a really interesting twist to his interactions with people. He'll be disregarded or mistreated on sight and often can't even speak with people to pick up side quests without a non-Branded being present to pretend to be his master. It's a smart way of making people care about the political aspects of the story right away because you're confronted with the problems in the system almost every time you interact with a stranger. And those political aspects are used very smartly as a supporting element to the story. While I tended to just completely space out whenever any of the political stuff came up in games like Final Fantasy XII, I found it much easier to follow here, largely due to the game doing everything it can to make it accessible. Early on, you'll obviously not know and not really care about the difference between the Empire, the Kingdom, the Dominion, and the Republic, because those are all just kind of bland proper nouns that you've heard a million times before. But if you start to get lost at any point during a cutscene, you can pause to bring up codex entries for everything that's being talked about. These even change throughout the duration of a cutscene as new topics get brought up. This is a nice compromise between oversimplifying things to make it so anyone can follow along, or not caring if people follow the political aspects of the story. Later on in the game, you'll even have a map you can access at any point to see the various wars or movements of any given country. Like I said earlier, the world building is my favorite part of the game, and even if these lore entries are a bit of a band-aid solution, I still think they did the job of keeping me interested in that aspect of the story. One of the things that's kind of notable about Clive is that he goes through his biggest character arc rather early on in the story, as he comes to terms with his past and his desire for revenge only a few hours into the game. This means that as a protagonist, the rest of the runtime is focused more on establishing the type of person he is rather than discovering it. This has the story going outwards from Clive in a more believable way. Allowing the player to witness this means that when the story has him fulfill the standard nice guy protagonist trope who always wants to help everyone, you understand why. He's accepted who he is rather early on, and his struggle becomes making the world a better place rather than strictly personal motivation. From here, his genuine desire to help attracts interesting allies and enemies in a natural way. Beyond all that, let's go back to that initial demo, that initial appeal of just wanting to know what happens next after a compelling story moment. Because while I'm sure this is not universal, I felt that desire to see what happens next for pretty much the entire runtime. There's always some struggle or some antagonist on the horizon, and I found it constantly difficult to find a stopping point, because I could sense the next big story moment and I wanted to see what it was. This obviously won't be true for everyone, which we'll come back to in a second, but it was true for me right up until the ending in the pit in the stomach I mentioned at the start. The story is paced slow in many parts, but it's still paced well. These slower moments involving mostly conversations or minor side quests are there to balance out the sheer insanity of the more climactic sections. When the game throws these high-octane boss fights at you, it feels like it's earned the right to do so by setting things up in an interesting and deliberate way. The group of characters surrounding Clive is also quite likable. Obviously, the game sort of cheats by having the group stand for the rather relatable cause of slaves are bad, but the individuals are memorable. There's the scout Gav, who seems to simultaneously have no idea what he's doing and know exactly what he's doing, or Clive's uncle Byron, who has this storybook notion of what an outlaw is and tries to insert himself into Clive's cause in order to live out that fantasy. But the main set of party members and antagonists are the bigger strength, with their relationships evolving naturally over time. The antagonists don't just show up and hate you, they have history with you, they have reason to fight you beyond just being dicks. It allows the story to jump from event to event using these relationships to connect everything. And I think sitting down and writing this script, I genuinely got a greater appreciation for how well everything is connected together. This feels like a game that was written from start to finish, as opposed to most video game storytelling, which often seems like more interesting moments tied together with filler. Because while much of the content does seem like filler, it also seems to have a purpose in setting up the next big moment. When the game succeeds time after time in paying off that setup, you're more likely to care about the next setup and the next payoff. But here's the trick to it. Stories are quite possibly the most subjective aspect of gaming. I can explain why I liked it, why certain things worked for me, but they just as easily might not work for you. This is the danger of making a game so laser focused on story. Sometimes you'll get a Final Fantasy X, and sometimes you'll get a Final Fantasy XIII. Sometimes you'll get an Uncharted, and sometimes you'll get an Order 1886. And while there can still be a common opinion that certain stories are better than others, in the end there's no escaping that a huge portion of this is going to be personal preference. And this is why the title of this video is what it is. For a game that reviewed this well, sold this well, and had so much hype, there's a large group of people where this will just have absolutely nothing for you. If you don't enjoy the story of the game, it has almost nothing to fall back on, nothing to otherwise engage you. I can admit that even knowing this game will go down as an all-timer for me, it's a game that I would only recommend to certain types of players. It released next to a few other titles that had similarly glowing reviews, but while review scores reflected their mass appeal, in this instance it reflects how good this game will be for people who like games of this type. The game is story heavy, slow paced at times, has flashy combat with not a ton of depth, it's linear, and it's cutscene heavy. These are things I don't mind and in some cases actually love, but each one of these things might separately be a deal breaker for another player. As opinion on this game inevitably becomes more and more divisive, it's important to remember that there's completely valid reasons for people to love this game, but at the same time there's completely valid reasons for people to hate it. If you buy this game, you should know what you're getting into. It's weird reading this script back to myself and knowing it's talking about a game I truly loved. The game's failures are obvious and numerous, and equally obvious are that with things like exploration and RPG elements, there was barely even an attempt. In so many ways, the game feels like a bunch of bare-bones systems duct taped onto the only things the developers really cared about, those being the story and the combat. And even the story and the combat have their noticeable problems. But I can't shake that feeling of wanting to know what happened next. That fantasy world and story that I found myself getting lost in, to the point that I was playing too much and it was impacting my daily life. I can't shake that pit in the stomach. Thanks for watching. I wasn't originally planning to make a video about this, so I had to use footage of other people's playthroughs in parts. I will link those channels in the description. If you enjoyed this video, consider subbing or leaving a comment. It lets me know people are interested in this type of content.